Hey guys, and welcome to the Performance Hub podcast, and thanks for tuning in. So before we get started, we want to let you guys know about an amazing offer we have going at the moment. Using the coupon code COMMUNITY, we have 1 month free access to the Performance Hub. So this is our online members site where we have tons of content from in-depth exercise tutorials, videos on different strength and conditioning methods, program templates, articles on nutrition, stress management, and just a ton more content. So head over to www.pikeperformance.uk to sign up and get started on that today. As well as that, below this video, we've linked all our social media channels, as well as all of our guest socials. So go and like and comment and share, as it really helps us to be able to produce more content for you guys, like the interview that we have today. Okay, so that's enough of that. Let's dive into today's interview and see what it's all about.
Okay, welcome to the Performance Hub podcast. After a slight scheduling snafu, we are back, and we have with us Dr. Mike T. Nelson. He runs the Flex Diet certification and has has been published in a number of magazines and scientific journals, as well as consulted with professional sports teams at the highest level in regards to subjects such as metabolic flexibility, which is going to be the subject we're going to talk about today, aerobic training methods, heart rate variability, and a number of other kind of subjects in the exercise physiology field, where he has a PhD and is an exercise physiologist. So really excited to dig into the subject today of metabolic flexibility, because this is something I'm really interested in at the moment. And I think if we can try and lay it out in kind of layman's terms, there's going to be a lot of take-home kind of action points that you'll be able to put into your training and lifestyle after you hear this podcast. So look, without further ado, let's dig into it. All right, guys, so welcome to the Performance Hub podcast. Today we've got Dr. Mike T. Nelson with us, all the way from, is it Minnesota?
Minnesota, correct,
Minnesota,
yes.
Yeah, so a little distance from us, but we're all in a very similar situation at the moment with these lockdown measures and things like that, so it's a great chance to kind of catch up with coaches around the world and kind of learn a little bit more. So we want to speak to or listen to Dr. Mike T. Nelson today talk about metabolic flexibility. But before we do that, we'll just check in and sort of ask you a little bit about how you've got to where you are today and your background, if that's okay.
Yeah, perfect. I guess on the academic side, and even before that, I'm 6'3", so I was an eel-shaped rake person, weighed 156 pounds going into college, and I'm like, oh, maybe I should start lifting weights. And I was interested in biology and got stapled by the bar in high school on a bench press. And so I kind of got into it from the opposite end of the spectrum of someone who sucks really, really bad at all of these things, and sucked really bad at all of these things for quite a while. And then you do stupid stuff and injure yourself and screw yourself up. And so I started taking physiology classes as my undergrad. And the college I went to, St. Scholastica in Duluth, Minnesota, had one of the rare places where even an undergrad could take anatomy and physiology, and you actually got to work on human cadavers. So they had new cadavers that came in every quarter, which was really rare for an undergrad intro program. So that was awesome. So I did a Bachelor of Arts in Natural Science and decided to go into engineering. So I did 2 years of postgraduate work, and then I did 2.5 years for a master's in mechanical engineering. And I initially was doing more biomechanics, was kind of more of my classwork area, and then I couldn't get any funding for it, so I ended up doing a heat transfer project. So I created a computer generated model of a monkey in front of a really big microwave transmitter, which the military later used as something called the active denial system. So they have this really big microwave transmitter on the back of a truck, and they point it at a crowd of people. And it's in the gigahertz range, so super, super high frequency, what's called millimeter wave. So very small penetration depth, like 1-2 millimeters into the skin. But as you know, like the top part of your skin is pretty sensitive. There's a lot of sympathetic nerve endings there. So it hits these nerve endings and it lights them up. So it feels like you're being burnt by a light bulb, but there's not any deep tissue heating effects of it. It's not like a microwave where you can really cook any food with it. So that was an interesting project, which at the time was so classified, they didn't tell me it was classified. So I didn't find all this out till 5 years later, although it was a little suspicious when, like, I published my research, and 3 people I'd never met in my life from Brooks Air Force Base, like spontaneously, show up on the on the published research. So I finished that and said I'm never going back to school again, which lasted about a year. Started taking physiology classes again just for fun. I worked for a medical device company for about 10 years in cardiology products. So implantable pacemakers, defibrillators, a lot of troubleshooting, design, reading EKGs, talking to electrophysiologists, that kind of stuff. But the whole time I was just more interested in training. I didn't know what I wanted to do with it. So I thought, well, I'll go back to school again. So I went back to school to do a PhD in biomedical engineering. And I finished all the classwork for that except for 2 classes, which took about 5 years. So I was kind of sort of full-time, off and on. And I eventually just dropped out of that because I got tired of doing a whole bunch of math. Math was never really like my strong suit. Physiology I did pretty good at, but math was just, I paid people to tutor me during my undergrad. I showed up in the professor's office like every week. It was just really hard. So I ended up just dropping out of that and went to the exercise physiology department. And the first day I got in there, they're like, hey, we got 2 new projects and they both involve a lot of math. I'm like, oh no. And there's like only like 5 people there. And my advisor, like I'm sitting at the end of the table, he points, he goes, hey, you new math boy, whatever your name is, like these are your projects. And it was on metabolic flexibility and heart rate variability.
Oh, wow.
And that was probably, 13-ish years ago now, actually.
Okay.
And luckily the math wasn't, too horrible. It was, pretty horrible if you're an exercise phys person who doesn't take a lot of math, but wasn't too bad. So I ended up finally finished that. It took 7 years. And then along the way, I started training people in 2006. So I've been doing that for about 14-ish years now. Worked at a gym for a while, did the sort of standard thing, realized I wasn't really cut out for that. And it was just a monster pain in the butt, right? Because everyone who's a trainer knows, or even a coach, right? Most of your stuff's going to be early morning. Most of it's going to be later during the day, depending on when you have athletes, when you have students, clients, all that kind of stuff. So right now I've been transitioned to training clients online, which I started doing that full time about 6 or 7 years ago.
Okay.
And currently I'm an associate professor of exercise at the Kerrigan Institute. I teach online for Rocky Mountain University, Georgia Southern University. And then I have a certification I created, which is a Flex Diet Cert based on metabolic flexibility, which we'll talk about here today. And probably just other random stuff, a little bit of research and things like that here and there. So in my free time, as we talked about, pick up odd objects and try to kiteboard as much as possible.
Awesome. Yeah, I love the odd object, the grip training stuff. It's
yeah, it's fun.
A little passion of mine that's starting to build, getting the old loading pin and the rolling thunder and the grippers.
Yeah, rolling thunder is it's humiliating because you look at it and you're like, it's just a one-hand deadlift. And you're like, why can't I pick hardly anything up off the floor?
It's super hard. We've got a bit of a challenge where I'm a personal trainer at an MMA gym. So all the jiu-jitsu guys and MMA guys have become obsessed with the rolling thunder and all the different attachments we've got to it. So we've got a bit of grip strength kind of community going at the gym. It's quite good.
Yeah, that's super fun. I ended up doing a grip competition in Finland actually last year.
Wow.
I was just hanging out with the guys, and I wasn't really probably good enough to technically qualify, but I got an invite anyway.
Nice.
Yeah, it was fun. It was a good time. It was, everyone in the community is just super nice, and it's like any small, niche, whether it's strength and conditioning or even, grip training. There's only so many people in the world that even do the silly things you're trying to do. Like even in the gym here yesterday, I was doing some bench press stuff, which is fun. I mean, I don't mind it. And I got a PR on bench press, and then I got a PR on it's a Thomas Inch replica dumbbell, so it's 107 pounds.
Yeah.
I was like way more excited about getting reps on that than I was like about my bench press. I just could care less about that. So
I think I saw in your story you've got like a kind of pinch block barbell.
Yeah, Saxon bar.
Beast.
Yeah. So for people listening, they're like, what are these guys talking about? Imagine a 2x6 piece of wood, right? It's about 2 inches by 6. And then you can put standard plates on the end. So when you go to pick it up, you're doing what's called a pinch grip. So your hands are like pinched, like if you were to hang from a rafter, but it's like you can do a deadlift now. So the nice part is because you're using both hands and you're using a deadlift movement, you can get a lot more load than on some of these tiny little implements. So tip I got from my buddy Adam Glass, who's a top competitor in grip, is in training, prioritize the things you can probably load heavier. Right, so even 2-inch diameter stuff, axle, Saxon pinch bar, stuff like that, that there's still huge amount of grip and force through the hands and the forearms, but you're probably going to see a little bit better progress with that, and especially like people you're training. What I've noticed too is you see a lot more transfer.
Yeah.
Right, you started getting, everyone like wants to do grippers, which is great if that's what you're into. I personally, I don't care, but I just find that at some point, like after even a couple months, like grip training on a gripper is really hyper specialized. And I don't find that it transfers to a lot else. Or if you get someone strong with like a 2-inch diameter on a deadlift, that has a really high tendency to transfer to a lot of other stuff and back to their standard 1-inch diameter lifts too.
Yeah. I think looking at like jiu-jitsu or MMA population as well, generally like bad backs, back injuries are fairly rife. So
yes,
doing things like lifting off the floor with a weight that you might say is big enough to start training the hamstrings, the posterior chain might be difficult. Whereas starting to use like the fat grips or like an inch axle bar or the pinch bar that you've got might be a good way of limiting the weight that they can lift, but still training those motions and getting that grip training effect.
Yeah, for when I used to train more, I'll say younger male athletes who might have a little bit bigger ego than what they can rightfully deserve, I would not have them deadlift a straight bar. Like, okay, your normal deadlift when you get heavy looks like a pooping dog, and that scares me. So you are now doing all your deadlifts for the next 3-4 foreseeable future, double overhand on a solid axle that doesn't rotate, smooth grip, and it's a 2-inch diameter. And it's the weirdest thing to see them look at it and be like, oh, this isn't that hard. And they go to pick it up and they're literally starting at probably like a third of the way to their normal deadlift.
Yeah.
You know, and it's so weird if people have tried it. Like if you can't hold on to it, like there's this thing in your brain, if your brain's like, if I can't hold the bar, it's like you literally just get frozen in space. Like your hips don't pop up. Like there's nothing really quote unquote bad that just happens to you. You just can't move it. And it's a weird sensation, but it's also, I think, like you said, kind of protective, especially if you're working in a place where their goal is not to be a power lifter. Their goal is to transfer. You get some other side benefits. And if you're not able to watch every single rep they're doing, maybe they don't listen as well. And like for, MMA, like huge transfer, like doing RDLs, double overhand on an axle, you get hamstrings, you get a little bit of back, you get a little bit of grip. That's a great big bang exercise.
Yeah, for sure. All right, that was a bit of a random segue, but
yeah,
gotta love grip training and talking to people about it. But today, I wanted to talk about metabolic flexibility. This is a subject that I kind of first got introduced to on the Joel Jameson conditioning certification.
Cool.
Kind of
Joel's the man.
Yeah, he's a great guy. Hoping to get him on the podcast one day.
Yeah.
But they kind of touched on this idea of, wouldn't it be great if we could get people, burning fat when they need to burn fat, using carbohydrates and the stored forms when we need to do that at the higher intensity work. And this kind of idea of efficiently using the food that we're eating for the correct job really kind of struck a chord with me. And then finding your work, it kind of built on that. And yeah, I thought it'd be great to get you on and talk about that. So do you want to just explain a little bit about what metabolic flexibility is?
Yeah, so in fitness, there seems to be this general argument, I guess you could say, or discussion about, you have all the people that are like, no, fat's the best fuel ever and ketogenic for life, and you need fat and you need to burn fat, and most people suck at using fat, and all of that is kind of true. Then you've got other people that are like, but no, if you're training for performance, you need carbohydrates because that's the fuel for speed and power and high output. Even elite marathon runners are running almost entirely on carbohydrates. So even something we think as a endurance fat burning event is really a carbohydrate event. And the reality is both of them are kind of right. It just depends on like, what are you trying to do? So metabolic flexibility is how well can you use fat on one end of the spectrum? How well can you use carbohydrates on the other end of the spectrum? And then how fast and how well can you switch back and forth between those two? because most of the time they're not off and on switches. I tell clients and athletes, they're like dimmer switches, right? It's like, what kind of mix of fuel can you use that is the most efficient for the particular task that you're trying to do? So if you're doing, so I did a lower intensity ride on the bike this morning, just 5 miles at a low heart rate, fasted. So that's primarily going to be wanting to use fat as a fuel. I'm not going anything super high intensity or anything like that. If I were to test and do a 500 meter on the rower or do a lot of lifting or things of that nature, then yeah, I would want to definitely use carbohydrates as a fuel for that performance. So it's how well can you use both of the fuels, just depending upon what you're trying to do, and then how well can you switch back and forth between the two.
So there's, like you can see the obvious, I guess, benefits to performance, if you like, in sporting performance, making sure that we're using the correct fuel source efficiently for that job. I'll go a bit later. I'll come back to that point you made about marathon runners, because that's something I've always wondered about, the intensity of running and whether it would be aerobic or anaerobic. But so we can see the positive benefits for performance. In terms of people's health, why is this so important for people's health?
Yeah, that's a good question, because you can do lots of things as an athlete that may temporarily increase performance, but probably not the best for your health and probably not the best for the longevity of your career either. Fair amount of people I work with are trainers, and I work with another handful of athletes who have just kind of driven their car like they stole it, like their body, for a while, and now they're getting towards the end of their career and they want to try to get those last couple of years out, and they've kind of destroyed their health in the process, which makes it kind of interesting. So in terms of health, if we lose metabolic flexibility, so we become metabolically inflexible, we know that that's a progression to various disease states, the big one being type 2 diabetics. So type 2 diabetics are very metabolically inflexible. They initially have a problem using carbohydrates, and then over time, as the body compensates by putting out higher and higher levels of insulin, plus a whole bunch of other compensations, they actually start losing the ability to downregulate and use fat. So they're actually getting crushed from both ends of the spectrum. So they can become very metabolically inflexible. So a marker of health is, to me, how metabolically flexible are you? Like, how well can you use fat, especially in a fasted type environment? How well can you use carbohydrates? And again, everyone wants to go to one end of the spectrum or the other, right? It's like, oh, you're not healthy unless you can fast for like 3 days. But some of those people, they look at a Pop-Tart and their blood glucose goes sky high. It's like, yeah, that's probably not the best either, right? Yeah, maybe fasting for a period of time, maybe 19, 24 hours should be a good thing. It's probably a good marker. It's a new study that kind of looked at that agreed with that. But on the other end, the carbohydrate end, can you eat 2 Pop-Tarts and not feel like you're passed out under your table in an insulin-induced stupor? Right? Can you still function pretty well? Can your blood glucose not, skyrocket to some astronomical number? And you buffer that high level of incoming glucose. That doesn't mean you need to eat 2 Pop-Tarts for breakfast every day. It just means on those 2 ends of the spectrum, are you able to handle both of those situations? So and to me, that's a marker of health.
And would we be able to look at this in terms of someone's like insulin sensitivity, improving their sensitivity to insulin to manage that kind of glucose response?
Yeah. So ways to do that are managing insulin sensitivity. So when we say insulin sensitivity, we're generally talking about a whole body level, which includes muscle, organs, liver, everything in general. There have been some studies. David Kelly did these early studies where they did IVs and injections and measured a whole bunch of stuff just across the thigh in relatively lean athletes. So they're trying to look at what is just the role of muscle primarily, and it's a little bit different. But yeah, insulin sensitivity, I would say, is one of them. It gets a little messy because then we have to talk about, well, what tissue and how do you measure it and what do you look at? But from a global perspective, a simple way is just probably escalations in blood glucose, and in US metrics, you had 2 Pop-Tarts and your blood glucose goes up to, 180. you probably have some issues. If you're pretty well trained, maybe it goes to 120 and then just kind of comes back down again,
Mm.
right? So how well you can buffer those insults, and measuring blood glucose with just a handheld glucometer without any fancy lab equipment is probably, I'd say, the next level down, just to see where you're at. Again, if you can get access to lab equipment and fancy stuff, you can look at, insulin and get into clamp studies and a whole bunch of other stuff.
Mm. Yeah, or potentially, I guess, seeing, if you're having an MOT with your doctor, getting an HbA1c, something like that.
Yep. So yeah, HbA1c is going to be a pretty good marker of a 3-month average of blood glucose. So I would agree with that. If you have someone who does a lot of running or has a lot of what's called hemolysis, where they're just destroying red blood cells by heel impact, that may not be super active. So again, if you're working with athletic population, just be aware that's probably going to put you in a ballpark for an average. I don't know if I would 100% take that to the bank. But I would have them do AM blood glucose for about a week. That'll give you a pretty good idea of those two markers. And then if you're seeing something kind of wonky between there, obviously you want to talk to their physician about it. But another good test, which I got from Dr. Brian Walsh, is glycomark. So glycomark is this protein that gets changed in the kidney, and it's a marker of what's called glycemic variability. So this protein gets changed when you have these massive spikes in blood glucose that come back down. And because they're super high and very short-lived, they usually won't show up in a fasting because they're in response to a meal. And they won't show up a lot of times in the 3-month average, the A1C. So if you think you've got something weird, or you feel like the athletes complain, they get kind of symptomatic after having more carbohydrates, you're not sure. So go back to their doc and then ask for a test called glycomark. It's just a blood test. And if that's really wonky, then they're probably having this super high glycemic variability, which is, there's other data showing that that's not really good for health, not very good for performance either.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. So just to go back to this subject of using fat for fuel and using kind of the stored form of carbohydrates for fuel, just to clarify for people, when do we want to be using fat for fuel? What are the sort of like times throughout our daily life, or what types of exercise do we want to be primarily using fat as our fuel source?
Yeah, so most of the time hanging out, I would say using fat for fuel is probably a better source. Now, again, it gets into different cases, and if you have athletes who are trying to, gain weight, and there's a bunch of other different one-off type situations. But I would say in general, for most people who have some level of performance and body composition as a goal, most of the time you probably want to be using fat as a fuel primarily. Again, that doesn't mean you need to avoid carbohydrates all the time or get scared about looking at dates or anything like that. Also, during low to moderate intensity exercise, so we know that the benefit of fat is that it can produce a ton of ATP, right? So the cellular energy. So with just a little bit of fat, we can produce way more energy than we can with that same amount of stored carbohydrates. The downside is that it just takes longer to produce it. So if we're doing low to moderate intensity exercise, we don't really have to worry about trying to get this super high rate of ATP. We're just not working that hard that fast.
Yeah.
However, once you transition now to doing something that's a lot more speed and power, where the rate, so how fast can you get ATP to the muscles, matters, then carbohydrates are going to be a much better source. We can't extract as much pure energy from them, but we can get that out at a much faster rate. And because rate, once you move into speed and power, is one of the limiting factors, that's where that becomes more important. And again, it's all kind of a spectrum, right? So in my head, am I thinking, okay, if they're doing aerobic base building, moderate to low intensity on a bike or a rower or running or jogging or something like that in the morning, I primarily want that to be a little bit more under a fasted condition.
Okay.
As I want them to push and to try to use fat primarily as the main fuel source. If they're doing weight training or they're going to do, some rolling, things like that, that's going to be much more on the higher intensity spectrum. Again, depending on what they're doing and skills and development of the athlete. In that case, especially if it was a competition, I would want them to be able to use more carbohydrates and try to make sure that that's not a limiter for their exercise performance.
Okay. So we're looking at general endurance, lower intensity endurance work, and then just our daily living is primarily going to be using fat for fuel. And then as we get up into those higher intensity weightlifting, sports that involve power and short bursts of intense exercise are going to be primarily carbohydrates. You mentioned earlier that potentially like a high level marathon runner might be using carbohydrates a lot more than we actually thought they were. Why would that be? Because obviously that is a long endurance kind of work.
So the mistake people made, and I made this mistake too, is assuming that the length of the sport is going to determine the energy that's used. And to some degree, that is kind of correct. The caveat is we have to look at what level is the athlete. So the average so one of the things is someone comes in and go, hey, I want to run a marathon. I'm like, okay, that's not something I want to do, but if that's what you want to do, cool, we'll figure it out. We'll write you a plan. We'll get you to do it. My next question I'm going to ask them is, what level runner are you, right? So have you done this before? What is your performance? And then 2, what is your goal? Because a lot of people initially that come in, they assume in their head, they're like, well, I want to get leaner, so I need to run a marathon because that burns a lot of fat. Maybe, maybe not, depends on how you do it, which is very different from someone who's an elite athlete who says, yeah, I want to, break the 2-hour barrier or something like that, like something really, really crazy, qualify for the Olympics, whatever. So there's a study that was done where they took pretty high level half marathon runners and they gave them, I think it was nicotinamide acid, and blocked their body's acutely ability of using fat, and they had them run. And what they found was they didn't really decrease their performance at all. So what they did is they basically wiped out their body's ability to use fat during that event, and it did not really impair their performance. If you look at, what Nike did, try to break the 2-hour barrier, they had timed amounts of high glucose every 10 to 15 minutes. I think he was taking in excess of 100 grams an hour, I think. I'd have to double check on the exact number, but astronomically high. And granted, I mean, he's just a freak to begin with. But, 100%, high carbohydrates, high availability, as much as you possibly can. So it depends on what rate you're running, right? And if you look at an elite marathon runner, man, they're running the long distance, but they're running fast. Really fast. Like, I don't remember the exact times, but sub 2 is well under a 5-minute mile, I think. What was it, 4:37? I don't know. Someone's yelling at their computer right now because they know the number and I got it wrong. But crazy fast, right? So it's very, very high intensity for them compared to someone who just says, hey, I want to do a couch to 5K. Cool. That's awesome. You probably don't really need to worry about, hyper loading on carbohydrates all that much, right? You just need to get a little bit more aerobic base. You probably would do better using some fat as a fuel. And then you get into people that are in between. Someone comes to me and they're kind of and again, I don't work with a ton of endurance athletes, but if they're kind of middle of the road and their main goal is body comp and just something they want to cross off their personal list, and they've had issues with fueling, like their digestion doesn't feel very good, stuff like that, I may transition them to using mostly fat for a race, especially if we've got a very limited time. So again, it just depends. But the higher you go in intensity, the more you get to an elite level performance. Even for like a 100-mile run, like a lot of that is way more carbohydrates than I think what the average person would believe.
So is it a level? I mean, those guys, they're going to have a genetic kind of predisposition to being that way inclined, being a marathon runner, being an endurance person. There's going to be some genetic component, I guess, and then obviously some good training to get them there. But is it just their ability to be able to maintain, that work in probably their anaerobic energy system for that period of time, whereas most people would not be able to just sustain that around their anaerobic threshold? Do you think that's just their kind of genetic ability to be able to keep going at those higher intensities?
Probably a combination of a lot of stuff, right? I mean, is there some genetic stuff? Yes. We can look at the heritage trial was done at the University of Minnesota in terms of just baseline status, like VO2 max, right? So one of the professors I had there, Art Leon, he was the guy in charge of the study, massive study. And so they had people and their siblings in the study because they wanted to look at genetics and comparisons within family. And he said it was crazy that they would have some of these, Harley biker dudes and their kids would come in smoking a cigarette that they put out in the parking lot on the way in, don't exercise, don't do anything. And their VO2 max would be not too bad. It wouldn't be amazing, but it would be pretty good. And he said sometimes it would be higher than someone who was training and doing everything, correct. And if you look at the study, what you find is genetically, there's a huge difference in VO2 max. I also find it interesting that a lot of the endurance athletes I've worked with, which is not a ton, if you talk to them, if they've ever been tested early on, like most of them usually knew that they did pretty good before they ever really trained, right? And you see the same thing in strength and power, right? And Andy Bolton pulled 500 pounds in high school the first time you ever deadlifted or something in batshit crazy.
Yeah.
So there definitely is the predisposition to it. What exactly it is, who knows, right? I mean, and stuff that we do have good data on, like some of the Tour de France riders, like some of them have, like Lance Armstrong had a pretty high VO2 max. He appeared to have it since he was like about 18. Other riders, not that super high of a VO2 max, but they can go super high lactate level, right? They can go within a high percentage of their VO2 max and still not cross over into what's called producing a lot of lactate hydrogen ions. So there's different ways you can get there. There's some stuff with some of the Ethiopian runners that think that maybe because they've just always been running a lot of their life, their frame, their biomechanics are a little bit more efficient just because of their structure.
Yeah.
Most of them kind of grew up taking in a ton of carbohydrates. Maybe that was just because that's what they had available as food. And there's some stuff showing that maybe it's even stuff like digestion, right? If you just can't handle through your stomach a high amount of carbohydrates, maybe that's going to be kind of your rate limiter. Jeckendorf published a study showing that the amount of carbohydrates you can take in through the gut is probably trainable. Like most athletes will max out around 60 grams per hour. They did some training and they got most athletes up to like 90 grams per hour. The last part too is that there's another study, I can't remember who the author was, but a friend of mine, Ryan Baxter, pointed out to me. They took two, not high level, but higher level marathon runners. I think it was for 100-mile marathon, I think. One was like pretty darn good and one was good, but there's definitely a performance difference between the two. And the guy who wasn't as good, they put continuous glucose monitors in them. And what they saw is towards the end of the race, the runner who wasn't as good, like his glucose levels just tanked the last bit of the race. The other guy, they dropped, but didn't hit down nearly as hard. So maybe there's something, just how training, diet, who knows, that if you can kind of keep those glucose levels as more even, that's probably going to be a good thing. If they start tanking down and getting really low, despite them taking in high amounts of carbohydrates. So it wasn't that they were idiots and just forgot to fuel. They were still doing that, but something happened where they were just not able to maintain those levels. So probably a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And it kind of...
Oh yeah, it's fascinating.
Sounds like it fits with that idea that maybe some people do have a limit to the absorption of carbohydrate. Like you say, in the gut, how much can you assimilate and then start utilizing? Maybe there is a limit for some people. But
yeah, and another little trick I'll use too is you can use mixed carbohydrate sources. You can paradoxically use high fructose corn syrup in a certain amount, which people like just freak out. And other like dextrose, because different types of carbohydrates will compete with different basically ways they're absorbed in the gut, right? So there's different little proteins in there that absorb it. I use a fair amount of Atargo. I don't make any money from them, but that appears to work really well. I've been able to use pretty high levels with that, and rarely do I have any gastrointestinal upset or issues, as long as they mix it to the correct dilution. You mix it wrong, you'll definitely see some issues. Stuff like electrolyte balance matters. And other stuff that people forget too, as if you're more well trained, And let's say my VO2 max is like 70 compared to someone who's like 40. If I'm VO2 max is 70, I can probably exercise at a higher percentage of that VO2 max and be sub max, right?
Yeah.
So I have distance I can go, and my speed, my pace can be faster, but for that athlete, it's still sub of their max, right? So just like if you can bench press 400 pounds, we can probably train you to do the NFL combine test with 225 pretty good. If your max bench press is 235, it's going to be a lot more of a struggle. You're a little bit more screwed for starters there.
Yeah. So we're talking about that kind of aerobic reserve, like driving the resting heart rate down, and then just having a big old gap between that and our kind of anaerobic threshold.
Yeah, and on the other end, right, if you have a lower resting heart rate, right, you've got this range that's much bigger that you can now exercise through, right? It's just like if you were to drop a bigger motor or engine in your car, right, now I can go at, an RPM of maybe only 6,000 and still get a pretty high level performance compared to some little 3-cylinder engine that I've redlined and I'm still not getting close to that level of performance.
On that subject, with kind of using different fats or different or using carbohydrates more when we're doing what might seem like aerobic work, one of your more recent podcasts I was listening to earlier this week, and you said you used the Moxie machine, muscle oxygen kind of measurer. Oh, nice. And you were looking at the difference between the rowing machine and your bike. And I think were you measuring your quad?
Yeah, quad. Yeah, vastus. Yeah.
And so you were finding that the rowing machine was much more glycolytic than the bike. But we might think we could intersperse either of those, and they're basically going to be aerobic because of the intensity you're using. But you were finding maybe something slightly different.
Yeah. And so what I was doing is I stuck a Moxie sensor, right? This little guy here, which is a muscle oxygenation sensor. So people have seen it's not here on my desk, but little finger sensors they put on in the hospital, and they'll say saturation. Yeah, so that's looking at arterial, right? And if that starts dropping during exercise, you're going to be in a whole world of hurt, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff that's not going to be doing very well for you. But we can take that same, what's called NIRS technology, just passing a light, and we can look for muscle oxygenation levels. So we can try to be a little bit more specific about what we're looking at. So we're seeing how much blood flow kind of comes by, and then how much is what's called saturated. So these little red blood cells come by, how much oxygen are they carrying in a relative sense? And if we can sort of strip off more of that oxygen, it's going to be a little bit closer to more of a weight training stimulus. So for example, when I had a Moxie on doing squats, even for me doing, 5 to 6 reps, I would start at about 85% saturated. And at the end, as soon as I would rack it after the rep number 6, I would look and I was at about 12%. Right. So as the muscle's working, it's pulling off oxygen as it goes by. And when you did some stuff on the bike, I put it on my quad and I was about 55%. And it was pretty steady. It was just about 50, 55, 53, 55. And that wasn't a really heavy load. So that was a faster RPM speed, like just about 15 miles per hour, and just on a trainer. When I put it on a rower, I wasn't really trying to do a max or anything like that. Granted, my heart rate was a little bit higher, so it was probably a little bit more higher intensity. Within about a minute, I was down at like 12 to 14%.
Really? Wow. Quite a difference.
Yeah. So more different than I thought they would be. Now, again, this is an N of 1. It's just on me. But if you think about it, it kind of makes a little bit more sense, right? So the bike, you're only spinning, you're only using your legs, and you're doing it at a pretty fast cadence. So I'm not creating as much force per se, and the revolution is really, really fast. So that turnover is really, really fast, almost like a constant. On a rower, you're creating a lot of force, right? You're pulling it all the way back. Now you've got a little bit of relaxation to get back to the beginning, so to speak, if I'm not using technical terms, and then I'm going to pull again. I'm not trying to use rower speak here, so people understand what the hell I'm saying. in that point, because you're pulling against a flywheel, right? So if people have ever done rowing, the first thing you realize is, man, if I don't really try to create power really fast, it feels horrible.
Yeah,
And your brain figures out pretty fast that, oh, I have to accelerate this thing in order to get it all the way back. Or if I just go at the slow, moderate pace, it's just abysmal. So I think because there's more of a power component and it's probably shorter, again, I'm guessing your force is probably going to be a little bit higher. It's a little bit more like weight training. And then people are like, well, wait a minute, but if I do stuff on the rower, like aerobically, I'm like destroyed. But think of like how much muscle mass you're moving also, right? You've got a full body from lower body, upper body, you know, grip, back, all that kind of stuff. So you're actually moving more of your body, more muscle is activated than even just on a bike. If anyone's ever done the old school Versa climber thing,
yeah, we got one at the gym. Super hard.
they're hideous, right? Because what are you doing? You're moving a massive amount of muscle, but you're doing it in this repetitive cyclic type fashion. So rowing is like this weird hybrid where even if we look at like elite level rowers, I got this from my buddy, Dr. Kenneth J. You can check out his book, Cardio Code, which is awesome. They appear to have super high levels of power, but aerobically, they're still very, very high on the aerobic spectrum. So they're this kind of weirdy hybrid of stuff that I would have not expect to get to that level, right? So the amount of power an elite level rower can create is really high. And they can also do really well at endurance, right? Normally, we don't see those two qualities kind of together per se. Some other sports you kind of do, right? In the Tour de France, right? You see some, you know, riders who can create insane amounts of power and still have a ton of aerobic capacity.
Yeah.
CrossFit, you get into kind of the Metcon type thing. So yeah, it's interesting. And then also probably explains why, for me, like just measuring HRV and stuff after a rowing session, especially when I started doing it, was way more intensive than doing a bike. And I've noticed that with a lot of clients too. So yeah.
So maybe if someone was really deconditioned, you might think about starting them on potentially on a bike, because it's just going to be slightly lower intensity and working them up to rowers, Versa climbers, air bikes, more full body kind of demand, if you like.
Yeah, it depends on their goal. So the pro of the rower is I can put someone on for a shorter period of time, and if they're really limited on time, I can still probably get a nice hybrid of aerobic, anaerobic type stuff. A bike is probably going to be more on the aerobic side. I can make it a little bit more aerobic. I can make it easier probably for them. The downside is that, and some people are more deconditioned, their quads will start burning, and then just having them sit on that little bike seat just doesn't feel very comfortable.
Yeah, sure.
A lot of times their setup is not ideal. Another trick you can do on the rower, and you can do this on the bike. So the bike, you can obviously change gears depending on what type of trainer you're on, or just riding outside, hills, that type of stuff. On the rower, you've got a damper on the side. And most people, you'll go in and you'll pick what's called a drag factor. So you'll set the damper and you go in, and this little readout will tell you basically how much resistance there is each time you pull. And you can adjust that by how much air comes into the little flywheel type guy. Most of the time, you're going to be 110, 120, 130, somewhere in there. However, if for training specifically, you can play around with some stuff I did called an unloaded row. So just take the damper, go all the way down. On my setup, like the drag factor is only at about like 60. So it's well under half of what I'm normally at. So when I'm pulling, I'm not creating nearly as much power, but it's easier to pull, right? So I'm not creating as much force on each pull. Now, again, I'm probably going to have to make up for that by doing a higher stroke rate. So I'm going to have to move faster. But the next thing I'm going to test probably this week is doing that and see how much of a difference there is based on the damper setting. My feeling is it's going to be closer to the bike because you're creating less force for each pull, and you're moving faster submaximally. So you're getting probably closer to a bike. I don't know how close. But I've done that with some people where I'll do like a 5K unloaded.
Yeah.
And it it's a good way to practice technique and especially a little faster spin rate, and it's not nearly as fatiguing. So before I measured anything or even put Moxie on anything, I found like, oh wow, like doing the 5K unloaded is not that bad, right? Putting it back to a normal setting if you're trying to get like a PR below 20 minutes or whatever you're trying to get, oof, yeah, that's quite a bit different. I mean, you could just feel in your legs like a very huge difference too.
Could be an interesting way to kind of periodize people's use of the row, like, you know, taking the dampener up and down to kind of try and make it more true or more higher percentage of aerobic and then maybe a higher percentage of kind of glycolytic work if you were looking to periodize those two qualities.
Yep, so that's what I did exactly. Initially I start people with nasal breathing, just standard damper, because I just want them to get that technique a little bit. And my fear is if I start off just too light, it feels different. But then after that, exactly what you said, or if someone's like really new and I can't watch their training, I don't really know what they're doing, I can't, tweak it from week to week, I'll just start dropping in like 5K unloaded rows. So I may do like a 2K at an RPE of an 8. I may have them row for 20 minutes. I may have them do a 5K unloaded, and then I may just maybe throw like a 500 meter in if I want some anaerobic. I'll just kind of cycle through all of that, because the 5K unloaded is getting them more on the aerobic side, but doesn't really beat them up that much. Or the other stuff can be definitely a little bit more intensive.
Yeah, for sure. So getting back to the metabolic flexibility subject, it's so easy to drift off into other kind of.
Yeah, but the key with that too is that if I really wanted to prioritize the use of fat and really prioritize the aerobic system, and that was the only thing I cared about, I would probably do maybe more bike stuff or walking or maybe running if they can mechanically handle it, or maybe a 5K unloaded. I would probably do something more in that area. I would bias it that direction if that was my particular goal.
Well, we found actually with a lot of my clients and people I work with, the running, unless you're well conditioned to it, just starts but raising heart rate terrifically. And we were getting people to go and see how far they could run in 30 minutes, keeping their heart rate under 140, and not great scores were coming back, if I'm honest. Few people got very good scores who we expected it because they're very, very fit. Other people really struggled, and it was more of a fast walk for a lot of people. So running, I know for me personally, just sends it sky high, because I'm not very good at running, probably in a lot of pain. But cycling, rowing, things like that, much more kind of easier to keep that heart rate in that aerobic zone.
Yeah, and people forget for running, like how much technique that's really based on. And that makes a huge difference. So again, if I have people who can run, especially lately, people haven't had access to a rower or a bike, I'm like, okay, just go out, and I don't care about your heart rate. I want it to be lower. You're only going to breathe through your nose. If you have to breathe through your mouth, stop. And I want you to think about making it as fluid and as quiet as possible, right? So I'm trying to give them an external cue to change their biomechanics to prioritize efficiency. In the past, I used to have people come over and like, hey, let's do a Cooper run test, 12 minutes all out. And you're like, like sounded like a herd of elephants were coming down the road, and you watch these people, and I'm like going, oh my God, that's hideous. I want to throw battery acid in my eyes. I can't take this, right? So mechanics on running make a massive difference. Like even rowing, you get on a rower, you're not going to have elite level mechanics. You're not going to be close. But some basic instruction, I get shit from this all the time, but you can be okay. Right? It may not be the best and not be the most efficient, but it can look not too bad. And it can take a very short period of time to get to being, not that bad. Biking, same thing. Just kind of pedal. Is there different things? Yes, absolutely. But to get to just an okay level where you're not going to injure yourself, it doesn't take that much instruction. Running, oof, that's a while.
My last run, I saw myself in a shop window, and I thought, this is going to be my last run. This does not look good. This does not look good. But that comes from doing a sport where we mostly just roll around the floor. So running's never going to be our strong point.
Yeah. So, having MMA guys and hockey players run is
Okay. So looking at metabolic flexibility, how could someone measure, or how, I guess there might be two different things. How do we measure, or how do you measure in the lab, let's say, someone's metabolic flexibility? What are the markers you're looking for? Maybe apart from, we spoke about insulin.
Yeah. So there's not necessarily a gold standard for lab measurements of metabolic flexibility yet. There's a new study that came out that looked at how well you can use fat at a low to moderate intensity as one marker, which I would agree with. I did a study related to that. The study I did was looking at lower intensity exercise, and we had someone hooked up to a metabolic cart. So you breathe into this little tube, and it'll tell you with each breath how much is fat, how much is carbohydrates. So we took that and we baselined each person to a certain percentage, 30 or 60% of what's called their VT, voluntarily threshold, so that everyone is kind of working at the same percentage of what their max is. And then we took the RER, so that little number that tells you percentage of fat, percentage of carbs, and we took that and we ran actually a variability analysis on it. Our thought being that, if it's a little bit more variable, so tiny little changes, maybe that means that you have a more metabolically flexible system. And unfortunately, this was just a gauge R&R study to see if it was repeatable. Data says, yep, appears to be repeatable. Hopefully someone will run that again to see if it actually means anything, which we've been trying to work on that. So not sure on that part, but you can look at how well can you use fat at rest. You could do some type of feeding intervention then. So a simple way to do it would be give someone like oral glucose tolerance test, so about 80 grams of glucose or 2 Pop-Tarts, and then measure how fast do they transition to using carbohydrates. So that's been done by several different groups. George Brooks's group has looked at using lactate measurements in place of carbohydrate oxidation. Some good data on that. On the other end, you can do what's called hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp, which sounds like a lot of uber geeky words. But we put an IV in one arm, IV in the other arm. We put in a boatload of insulin. We put in a ton of glucose, and we escalate both of them and see how well you handle that in what's called a supraphysiologic range. I don't know how much that will correlate to people who are not in that range, but that's been done also. I would say it's debatable how applicable that is. So those are kind of the main ways that have been done. There's some stuff looking at food versus metabolism. So if we give you kind of this mixed meal that's mixed fat and mixed carbohydrates, we know how much there's each one. You ingest it, and then we put you on the metabolic cart. We measure what your metabolism is. Those two, what's called the food quotient and the respiratory quotient, do they kind of match each other?
Yeah.
So kind of some other approximates and stuff like that. In practice, I think a good marker is how well can you do fasting? Can you go 19 to 24 hours and be okay? Yeah, you might be a little hungry, but other functions are still pretty good. You can think, you could train if you had to. And on the other end, how well can you handle, high amounts of carbohydrates? How do you feel? Do you feel really tired and sleepy and end up, passed out in your bowl of oatmeal? Probably an indicator that you need to work on the carbohydrate end of the spectrum.
Really? So yeah, one of the tests I'd heard when I did the conditioning set was I kind of go and do some lower intensity or moderate intensity exercise fasted. And if you can do that and you kind of feel all right, you're probably doing okay. You're probably good at using fat for fuels. If you're doing that and you're ending up feeling maybe a little bit like hypoglycemia, a bit sick and dizzy and shaky, and your performance is poor, potentially not so good at using fats for fuels.
Possibly. I'd say that one's a little bit harder because we can aerobically burn carbohydrates.
Sure.
So that's kind of the bugger with that one. I mean, I have done that test. I think it will give you some data, but without looking at an RQ or an RER, we don't really know what fuel you would be using at that point.
Right. Okay.
Now we could get at it by purposely trying to have you fast. So if we do it after an overnight fast, your liver glycogen will be lower. So that may tell us some information about how well your liver is working in terms of if you're becoming more symptomatic. We could theorize that maybe your liver is having some issue because we pull glycogen out of it and you can't really use fat. Another way you can do it.
It's fasted exercise in the morning.
Correct. Yeah.
Right.
Yep. The other way you could do it without equipment, which would be brutal, and it's hard because of a high level of fatigue, is purposely trying to pull out some glycogen from the muscle by doing high intensity repeated stuff, wind gates, horrible shit, and then just giving you protein overnight, and then have you do fasted exercise that next morning. So now what have we done? We've reduced liver glycogen, we've reduced muscle glycogen, and so you're kind of left with either trying to extract the last amounts of muscle glycogen or being able to use fat. The hard part with that is that you have this high level of fatigue at the same time too, so it kind of mucks with it a little bit. But that would be another way.
That would be quite a punishment, I imagine.
Yes. Yeah. So in the Flex Diet Cert, I go into that there's a eustress and a distress way, right? So there's some data which is really split right now that in high level athletes, maybe purposely depleting them of carbohydrates and having them do exercise on low carbohydrate amounts, so glycogen, we do see an increase in these adaptation in terms of enzymes, right? So we do see a high amount of adaptation. Now, does that translate to performance once we give them adequate rest and we go back to providing carbohydrates before exercise? The data is pretty split, all right? So, one early study from 2016 now, I think, showed pretty huge changes in 3 weeks, right? So same macronutrients, same intake. They just played around with the timing of carbohydrates. And in one group, they actually lost body fat by 1% on DEXA. Their economy with running, everything got better. Some other studies that tried to replicate that didn't show the same effect. So 6 studies have kind of looked at it right now, and they're kind of split. So we don't really know for sure. But if you have an advanced athlete and they're kind of reaching the top of where they appear to be maxed out, maybe something you could play around with for 3 to 6 weeks in the off season.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you mentioned really maybe some better strategies for someone to input at home to find out whether they're quite metabolically flexible would be that fasting length, sort of being able to fast. And so what things would you be looking for when someone's doing, say, a 19 or 20-hour, 24-hour fast? What would it signify that they're doing it well, they're able to do it, apart from just keeping it, obviously?
Yeah, usually just how easy does it feel? If they feel lethargic and they never get off their couch and they can't exercise or walk around, probably have some issues. Also looking at the time course, right? So if they feel great in the morning and then by noon they feel horrible, there might be something going on. Part of that is also looking at, blood glucose regulation and stuff too, in sort of the background. So you're kind of just going by how do you feel? They could try to do some light level exercise, see how they feel with that. You're just trying to get a proxy to see how easy is it for them to do it. Is it the most amazing test ever? Not really, but it's pretty good proxy. And I said there's one study that's looked at it that showed it may be pretty useful. But again, you're talking about what some people can test with literally no equipment or anything else. So
sure. And so how would people, if people did do that and they were struggling, like you say, they were very fatigued all day, lethargic, and maybe they were getting very, very hungry, or maybe they just couldn't complete that kind of level of fast. How would people then, what things would you then suggest that people start inputting into their daily life to start improving this?
Yeah, so with that, I usually have them try to take a period of time. So take 1 day per week and then push out how long they're going to fast. So let's say Monday. So they had dinner Sunday night at 6 p.m. They normally eat breakfast at 6 a.m. So can we add 2 more hours to that? Could you eat breakfast at 8 a.m.? So you did 12 hours plus 2, you're at 14 hours already. Can we take the following Monday and instead of going breakfast at 8 a.m., could you do 10 a.m., right? Could you add 2 more hours to that? So I'll just kind of push them out about a couple hours. Eventually they'll have to, drop breakfast or replace, breakfast with lunch, that type of thing. So they start dropping meals off. Just progressive overload, really.
Yeah.
And then 6 to 8 weeks, most people can do a 19 to 24-hour fast pretty easily. And, again, these are generally healthy individuals too.
Yeah, sure. I mean, is what are your views on what qualifies as fasting? Because obviously there's a lot of kind of people of, if you read about it, everyone's got their own kind of rules, if you like, of what
Right.
fasted. Can you have black coffee? Can you have water, green tea, these sort of things? Some people say no, because you're starting to kind of get reactions or the liver working and things like that. Other people are saying that as long as it's a clear kind of low or no calorie beverage, you're probably all right. Where do you stand on that one?
I mean, the data I've seen, I think as long as you're not consuming anything with calories, you're probably going to be fine. Right? We can debate later about effects of a coffee and potential autophagy, and you've got some polyphenols and potentially micronutrients in there. But I'm like, I don't really worry about it. I just use the definition of fasting as anything that doesn't really have calories to it.
So that's good. I don't know if I could fast without.
Plus, it makes it easier, right? If I told most people, like, okay, you're gonna fast, you can't have your favorite, whatever, 1-calorie beverage and no coffee and no tea, they're like, screw you, this is the worst idea ever.
It'd be super hard.
Yeah.
Super hard. The headache alone would be super difficult.
Yeah, most people go through caffeine withdrawal, which is a whole nother issue. So yeah.
So that's the fasting. Obviously, you said that like when you do your cardio in the morning or aerobic work in the morning, you generally tend to do it fasted. Is this something else that's going to improve metabolic flexibility?
Yeah, so at that point, when we're fasted, our insulin levels are lower. So when insulin is lower, it does push our body to use more fats as a fuel. And there you're doing low to moderate intensity. If people are not sure and don't have a heart rate strap, they can just breathe through their nose. You can use the Phil Moffatone guide, which is 180 minus your age. All right, so 180, I'm 45. So my max heart rate would be 135. Yeah, I think that kind of gets people in a ballpark. If you're a pretty well-trained athlete, that's probably going to be too low. But average people, I think that gives you a marker for heart rate if you want to use that.
Yeah.
What we're doing then is we're trying to ramp up aerobic metabolism and trying to use more fat as a fuel for that. Or I guess you could call it fasted cardio, which that's a whole nother debate. But most people, when they talk about fasted cardio, are just only worried about body composition changes. I'd say the data on that is kind of mixed. Yes, I know Brad Schoenfeld's study was 4 weeks in females, did not show any effect, but I haven't seen anything that shows that it's negative. It's like they didn't gain weight. It's like I think there may be some positives to that with body composition, possibly via appetite regulation, but not a ton of data on that. But there's also a bunch of other benefits, and it's easier. Like for most clients, it's like, hey, what do you have to do? Some clients, it may be like, just go take an AM walk fasted. Like no sunglasses, get a little bit of sunlight in your eyeballs, and just walk. Like, well, what do I do before I walk? Not put your shoes on, open the door. Well, do I have to have anything to eat? No. Well, do I do anything else? No. Do I warm up? If you have to warm up before you walk, you've got other issues. You need to see a physical therapist, not me. So yeah, I think a lot of it just making it easier. And we do know that the better you can use fat for fuel as a marker of health, probably increasing your metabolic flexibility. You are directly burning more calories from fat. Does that lead to body composition changes or not? Debatable. But it's definitely not going to be a negative for you. So
yeah, sure. And so in terms of nutrition, like if we're looking at the types of food or the makeup of our meals, would you have some adaptations that you'd make to nutrition? So if we're trying to utilize more fat, would you head more towards that kind of keto style, or how do you approach that?
I would say that it really depends on the athlete, and it really depends on how many macronutrients they need to maintain or they can get away with. So the issue where I think it becomes more important is someone who's trying to increase performance or at least hold performance, trying to get better body composition, and for whatever reason, they're weight neutral on a lower-ish amount of calories, which is a whole separate topic. In that case, then yes, you just don't have much to work with. So I will prioritize more carbohydrates before and after exercise. If you have an athlete who's eating, I had a guy who was, trying to qualify for regionals for CrossFit Games. He was eating 530 grams of carbohydrates a day. So we don't care when you eat them, just eat them, But all his glucose numbers are fine. He's exercising twice a day, so he needed that amount for the goals that we're actually doing.
Sure.
So it depends, but I would say as you get more and more restricted, I do like putting more of those calories around the time of exercise for anaerobic stuff like weight training, things of that.
Yeah.
It also helps to try to keep your performance, right? Because that's going to determine your adaptation. That's going to determine the stimulus on the system also. But it's variable. A lot of it depends on how well you can use carbohydrates. If you're really good at using carbohydrates and you're at a moderate amount, your goal is some speed and power and body comp, you're probably gonna have a little bit of moderate carbohydrates with most meals. You're probably not gonna have a ton, but it's not gonna be like trying to do ketogenic in the morning and then refeed carbs at night. I just find that's probably not needed for most people.
Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of the cyclic ketogenic diet where you try to do keto like Monday through Friday and Saturday and Sunday as a carb fest or whatever. But just a more kind of moderate, somewhat sane approach, and then titrating that to the specific athlete and their goals you're working with.
So could someone use blood glucose readings to work out whether they were very good or good, efficient at utilizing carbohydrates?
Yeah, so an advanced thing you can do, I know Rob Wolf has talked about this in his 7-day carb test, I think it is, from his book, Wired to Eat. I will have athletes start testing different amounts and see where they're at. So normally I'll have them run, 2, 3, 4 weeks of just AM glucose. Just what's your baseline every time you wake up? Because that's affected by sleep, stress, a whole bunch of other stuff. If that's all good, everything's good there, cool. Now, again, these are for health ranges, not necessarily pathologic type stuff.
Yeah.
Then maybe let's just do a few readings after breakfast. What do you have for breakfast? Oh, I have a cup of oatmeal and a whey protein shake. All right, cool. Let's see where you're at, 30, 60, 90, 120 minutes later. If you're like up in the stratosphere and then crash and get hypoglycemic, and we've done this a couple of times, let's probably try to modify something in that meal. So you can get a little bit more specific. And it sometimes depends, obviously, on the amount, but also a lot of times in athletes depends on the type, which is crazy.
Yeah.
We did some stuff in Costa Rica with my buddy, Dr. Ben House, where we stuck oral glucose, continuous glucose monitors on a bunch of people, and we're measuring all sorts of stuff. And he did a follow-up study down there too on it. And man, like some people, they could crush ice cream and whatever, no change. One guy, like he would have like a little bit of pineapple and he'd like off the chart, right? So even the different types of carbohydrates will be a little bit different in terms of response for different people too.
Super interesting, isn't it? And so again, I guess that would be in with using different types of carbohydrates as fuel, being effective as fuel for that person as well.
Yeah, and so a way you can kind of get at it if you're not sure is have them do a dietary intake and then just have them record how do they feel during the day. So I do baseline heart rate, I do baseline heart rate variability, so I have an idea of their baseline stress levels. And then I'll look to see if there's a pattern after a week of doing that. So if 5 out of the 7 days they report they don't feel so good about an hour after breakfast, then I'm going to have them, okay, let's do some blood glucose testing on breakfast and see what we find, right? So if you don't want to turn into a human pincushion and prick yourself after every single meal through the rest of your day, you can kind of use the, how do you feel type thing, and then go back and try to do a little bit more in-depth into those things.
Sure. So if someone was good, their readings are not going to be seeing these big spikes and then drops. We're seeing maybe sort of more gradual raises and gradual falls, in response to their meals that they're taking in.
Yep. And, like I've done stuff where I've had, I don't know how many cups of rice and 2 Pop-Tarts and I got to like 120. I had a continuous glucose monitor, which was funny. And so the nurse who put them on, we had a little meeting. We all agreed to, share our data and everything. And I had it for 2 weeks. I was blinded, so I didn't see any of the results till the end. Okay. So the first week, I just did the normal stuff that I did. Like, okay, this would be a good baseline, just, normal-ish type stuff. Second week, I'm like, well, I might as well test the shit out of this thing, right? So I did a 24-hour fast one day. I had 2 Pop-Tarts for breakfast one day. I had 2 Pop-Tarts and 2 cookies for breakfast the next day.
That's great.
Like it is all sorts of crazy shit.
Yeah.
So we're looking at the data, and one person in our group was more on a ketogenic type diet, and her numbers were like super high after one meal. And so the nurse is like, well, what did you have at that meal? She's like, oh, I only had like, half of this like supposedly keto brownie that I had, and her glucose is like sky high. And she looks at me, she's like, well, what did you have for breakfast? I'm like, Tuesday, second week, I had 2 Pop-Tarts and 2 cookies. She's like, well, what was your glucose? I'm like, 125.
Crazy.
Yeah. So, because people forget also that if you do a more ketogenic type diet, you are going to be more sensitive to carbohydrates when they are reintroduced, because your muscle is trying to change local insulin sensitivity, or what's called a non-pathological insulin sensitivity difference. Because if it becomes more insulin resistant temporarily, it spares glucose for your brain. So it's not a pathology, it's not a negative thing. But if people went super, super hardcore keto for a long period of time and then have some carbohydrates and don't feel good, yeah, that's probably because their muscle is still in that particular state, and it's trying to prevent glucose from coming in because it wants glucose to be preferentially shuttled towards the brain because there's not much of it around.
So would the same thing happen maybe to a lower degree with people who have like a lower carbohydrate diet, say, below 100 grams of carbohydrates?
Potentially, yeah. So it's called non-pathological insulin resistance at the muscle level. So what I've seen is that in practice, I call anywhere like total carbohydrates from 50 to 100, 110 is this kind of like the dead zone, right? So Charlie Francis had what he called the dead zone, that kind of intensity area where he doesn't like athletes training. He didn't notice any positive benefits from it. I just don't notice much positive in that area.
Yeah.
Like if you're like at 70 grams of total carbs a day, it's probably too high to be really ketogenic, depending on your fat and your protein levels. It's probably too low to be doing anything to help you regulate glucose very well. You're just going to feel lethargic. You're going to feel tired. You probably don't have enough carbs to even cover your training at all. So paradoxically, if people let me, I'll just bump them right away to 120 grams per day, which is still, in my opinion, low. It's not super high. And they're like, oh my God, I feel so much better. Like I can function during the day and I actually made it to the gym. I'm like, hey, cool. Or if you want to do keto, then, by all means do keto, but then you might have to be more restrictive and make some other changes then.
So someone trying to improve their insulin sensitivity, going for a low, very low or no carb approach, maybe not the best idea?
Possibly. It depends on what's going on, right? So there's a lot of things that regulate that. There's insulin, basically insulin secreted uptake of carbohydrates, which will happen at a higher level of carbohydrates. Most of what we use day to day is what's called non-insulin mediated uptake, meaning that contracting muscle tissue independent of insulin can actually pull glucose right out of the bloodstream.
Right.
So if someone is running higher blood glucose, but it's not necessarily pathological, so they're not talking to their physician about it, they're not type 2 diabetic.
Yeah.
The first things I'm looking at is total calories, movement. Like how often do you move during the day? They're like, oh, bro, but I train 45 minutes a day. All right, well, if we look at the accelerometer data or any data from one of your watches, it shows you move about 3,000 steps per day and you look like a slug the rest of the day. Right? So you're not moving at all. You train hard, but then you just sit on your butt the rest of the day because you have a desk job, that kind of stuff. Sleep makes a huge difference. One night of poor sleep impairment, you can become temporarily insulin resistant. So usually those are the things I'm going to look at first. And yeah, I mean, if they're really high eating, 7-Eleven Slurpees with no ice and nothing else, then yeah, you probably want to cut down on that kind of stuff in the meantime. But it's going to be a combination of a bunch of stuff. Because what I've seen is people just doing a very low carbohydrate diet, not necessarily making any other lifestyle changes, and then going, well, why didn't it fix it?
Yeah, sure.
Well, you probably did something that was good, but it probably, in my experience, just wasn't quite enough.
And there's probably other like big rocks, like you say, that really everyone should be doing to some degree, moving around a lot and, eating. Well, not everyone should be eating a lower calorie diet, but that would be a big rot if someone's trying to kind of lose some weight and become more insulin sensitive. Maybe they're on that borderline of type 2 diabetes. But yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Sleep makes a huge difference with that too. Like massive difference. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been monitoring my waking blood glucose, and
Oh, nice.
after we've got 2 kids, and after sleep, they don't sleep well, we don't sleep well. If they sleep well, we sleep pretty well. But nights where it's been a bad night, like certainly it will be elevated in the morning, maybe up to high fives, maybe sometimes a 6. And then times where it's been great, I think I got like a 4.9 the other day. These are the
nice
day readings.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing to do though, certainly. I've not played around with like pre and post prandial readings, so I'm definitely going to look into that and see it, try and get some idea about sensitivity to certain different carbohydrate sources. I think that's super interesting. Something that a lot of people could do. Be definitely interesting from a performance aspect as well, in terms of fueling. So if people have been following some of the guidelines that we've spoken about today, and they're looking to improve their metabolic flexibility, maybe they've done it for 3-6 weeks, something like that, what things would you see? Would it be mostly subjective markers that they might see changing to kind of mark that improvement?
Yeah, most people are going to see changes in subjective markers. Usually overall energy will feel better. If they're measuring stuff like blood glucose, things like that can get better. Some people usually, in general, get a little bit leaner. Body comp gets a little bit better. Sure. Usually they find they're much better able to regulate their food, which is a whole different topic of, I just pulled, 15 papers again the other day, trying to figure out, I've had this little theory for a long time. It's not necessarily my theory, but that if you're better able to switch and use fat as a fuel, does that reduce your overall appetite because your body is still getting energy from another source? If you're not very good at doing that, do you become more hungry because your body then is fluctuating appetite up to try to keep glucose in a more tightly regulated space? I think that's probably true, but I don't know. I'm like my 5th way through the literature again to try to see if it's true or not, because there's so many other confounding factors involved in that. Like we said, sleep, movement, stress, a whole bunch of other stuff. But if I were to guess, I think there is something to that. So yeah, and usually people find that when we start reducing their calories, that their life doesn't become hell right away. That they appear to be able to buffer that a lot easier than if we hadn't done any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I've often suggested people to eat higher fat in the morning with a lower carbohydrate kind of breakfast, if you like, for that reason, to try and get people through to lunch or later in the day with that, and just having more of a steady kind of energy level and not having these peaks and troughs of hunger. It'd be interesting to see that. I've never read any research that really like backs that up on like a kind of cellular level, but it'd be interesting to see that.
Yeah, there was some animal work from, I think it was Bray's lab a couple of years ago, where they did that approach, and in animals was pretty effective. So there were some people running around saying that, oh, this is the best thing to do for humans, that if you just avoid carbs in the morning, like your RQ, your RER, you'll just be burning fat the whole rest of the day. It sets your metabolic rate and all this stuff. And I don't know about that. As a strategy, I think it's useful.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
More people have been speaking about higher carbohydrates in the morning to match with kind of circadian rhythms lately. I've read a few.
Yeah, so that's gone the other way now, right? Yeah. So for a while we had no carbs at breakfast, and then we had have carbs at breakfast, not in the evening. Then we had studies showing that, like the classic study that it was gave a group of people, again, not athletes, but a bowl of like Raisin Bran or cereal at night, and they got leaner. They're like, whoa, what the hell happened with that? And their theory was, well, because they had a treat in the evening, they were better able to maintain, caloric control during the day and at dinner compared to the other group. So maybe it didn't have anything to do with the carbohydrates at night. Maybe it was just all, not necessarily a trick, but more on the psychology side, and they just ended up eating less. And then now we're back to some people I heard, no, you want to have higher amounts of carbohydrates in the morning because cortisol is going to be higher and you can burn them out throughout the day. And I don't know. I mean, I've got people that are on both ends of the spectrum. And I think if you're really metabolically flexible, it probably doesn't matter that much either way. I mean, as long as you're getting in enough carbohydrates for your energy needs to meet your training and everything else, yeah, you should probably do okay on a high fat steak and eggs breakfast and be good. You should probably do okay if you had 2 cups of oatmeal, right? Some people may respond better to one than the other. And if you do, great. Just go with that then. So
I guess that's the ideal position we kind of want to be in, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
We want to be able to, choose to have your fry up for breakfast if you want it, or
Yeah.
choose to have your cereal if you're rushed for time or whatever, and know that your body's going to be able to utilize those when you want to utilize it, rather than being over reliant on one substrate or the other.
Yeah, because the average person who's training and exercising, the question that they want answered that they'll really never ask you is literally like, okay, like how shitty can I eat and still look pretty good and still have good health?
Yeah.
I mean, that's like most people, right? That's probably most of what I do too,
Yeah, that's interesting. And then we get into, I mean, do you look at, obviously your certification called the Flex Diet, do you look at like that kind of, is it flexible eating kind of approach?
Yeah, so the Flex Diet is a mashup between metabolic flexibility and flexible dieting.
Yeah.
Right. So flexible dieting is more, as long as you're kind of getting the right, macronutrients, you're not being an idiot, you're probably going to be okay. And there's good research to support a more flexible approach for adherence and compliance, and everything else is much better. And then the metabolic flexibility side is, okay, so are you able to process more fat pretty good? Are you able to process more carbohydrates pretty good? So what I think is interesting, some people doing a very flexible diet approach, if they don't have metabolic flexibility, they may, from a health standpoint, not be doing very good, right?
Sure.
So if you can't regulate blood glucose very well and you're like, screw it, I'm just eating Pop-Tarts, yeah, you may get leaner, right, if you cut down on the number of Pop-Tarts you're eating, but you're probably not doing your health and your longevity any favors either.
Yeah.
So I kind of look, obviously I'm biased, but I kind of look at it from, both ends of the spectrum. You kind of want the physiology on this side to match, what you're doing with the nutrition on the other side. And if they're not kind of lining up, then you need to make some changes and adjustments.
Okay, well, the last thing I want to ask, and I ask this to most of our guests, is if you had 3 tips that you could give people for kind of high performance when it comes to health, 3 tips that we could give people to improve their health and their performance day to day, what would be your top 3?
Top 3, if it's just the physiology, not necessarily the psychology of it, would be just go to bed, like just sleep more. Everything will get better, I promise. Breathe better, both mechanics and the amount. And just do some recreation, do something that's fun, and go move, learn a new skill. Go learn to kiteboard.
Yeah. 3 great tips.
Yeah.
Look, thanks, Mike. Thanks for coming on. Where can people get hold of you if they want to do the Flex Diet, sir, or if they just want to come and kind of read your work? Where can people get hold of you?
Yeah. So the best place is going to be through the newsletter. So probably 80-90% of my content goes out to the newsletter. Just free to get on. You can go to www.miketnelson.com, MIKETNELSON.com. At the top of the main page, there'll be a little banner there where you can get onto it. We also have a newsletter through the Flex Diet cert also. They can get access to that. Right now, it's still open for a period of time just due to the weirdness in the world and all that kind of stuff. But that's Flex Diet, just www.flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com. So those would be the best places.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
No worries.
Okay, so that was a great conversation. Real pleasure to catch up with Dr. Mike T. Nelson. It was really interesting to pick his brains around metabolic flexibility, aerobic training, and grip training in different areas that we spoke about. If you're a trainer, or even if you're just someone who's into their fitness and eating healthy, then go and check out his website. He's got loads of great blog posts, and his email blast is really informative. It's really good stuff on Facebook as well, so it's definitely worth following. and his Flex Diet certification is excellent as well. So I would definitely recommend going and checking that out if you want to learn more about metabolic flexibility. If you get the chance, like, comment, and share this podcast. It really helps us to create more good content like this. And I hope you enjoyed this one. We've got another one coming out next week with Johnny Ty, where we'll be talking about all things to do with hydration. And again, that's another really interesting podcast with loads of tidbits there that you can take away and start actioning straight away. So, like I said, like, comment, and share, and we'll see you next time.